Welcome to the third episode of the AI Tomorrow podcast, a biweekly podcast from the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. In each episode, we will be exploring topics related to artificial intelligence, consciousness, and AI ethics. I'm your host, Bartlomiej Pochorecki, and the following is a conversation with Blaise Aguera y Arcas, a vice president and fellow at Google Research, where he leads a team working on machine intelligence. His group works extensively with deep neural nets for machine perception and distributed learning. Blaise recently also published a book titled Ubi Sunt. It's written in a way that draws from the postmodern tradition. It isn't easily categorizable as fiction or non-fiction, with AI dialogues intertwined with personal reflections on life, and of course, much more. I'm certain I haven't given enough justice with this short account, so I encourage you to check out the link in the description of this episode and find out about the book yourself. AI Tomorrow podcast is available on all streaming platforms, including YouTube. I hope you enjoy this episode. Could you explain what are you currently working on at Google?
I'm working on a pretty broad range of problems. So I have a largish team. It's over 600 people, and many of the technologies that my team works on are at the intersection of AI/ML, whichever you'd like to call it, and privacy and devices. And so that includes AI features for the phone, for Pixel, and for Android. It includes fundamental technologies like federated learning, which is all about privacy-preserving ways of doing machine learning. It includes even more basic research, actually, on sociality and intelligence as well, and of course lots of features, both for intelligent devices and that are personal, like the phone, but also environmental. IoT type devices with AI in them, or AIoT as it's sometimes been called.
Do you have any specific motivations for doing that work? Is it to improve the user experience, or is there any big end goals you have?
Yes, I certainly have some big end goals. My motivation overall is that I feel like technology, and especially the sort of new kind of neural computing technology that has really risen in the era of deep learning and beyond, is something that affords us sort of superpowers, both as individuals and as a society. And I'm not just interested in improving the user experience of services, as they've been made, but rather changing the terms of engagement between people and technologies in ways that preserve and augment humans and our agency, and essentially decoupling things like surveillance and the monetization of people's attention and so on from what I think is the prosthetic capability of these technologies.
In one of your talks, you mentioned regarding the privacy that the future with one giant general AI that is embedded in all of us is worse than the future with local AIs that can augment us as individuals. Could you expand on that?
Sure. I mean, the idea that AI equals some kind of singular brain. Actually, let me take a little bit of a step back. Intelligence, I believe, is inherently social and inherently multi-scale. And what I mean by that is that I believe that intelligence is something that emerges in interactions between entities, as opposed to in a thing unto itself. I think that life itself, multicellular life, is a wonderful example of lots of little alive things collaborating to make a bigger alive thing. I think that our neurons, are lots of little intelligent things collaborating to make a larger intelligent thing, to make our brains. We have so much focus and emphasis on the individual in our society, in modern Western society in particular, that I think we fail to recognize that intelligence is also, largely not something that resides in our individual brains, but is social, is something that comes about through cultural accumulation of all of us working together. So in that sense, I do think that there's one giant intelligence, but that intelligence is all of society. And the addition of artificial neural nets, alongside natural neural nets, is just a further elaboration of what we've already got. But but there's always a kind of balance of power, if you like. There's always something like a socioeconomic political bargain in play, if you like, between the parts and the whole. And the thing that I've always been concerned with is to keep that balance in a place where, you know, what we think of as individual people remain free and remain and remain unchilled. Right, we still have the sense of agency and privacy that I think is, you know, is a really great achievement of modern liberal democracy in an era where we're all so heavily interconnected that in certain ways, you know, things do start to look like you know, like a kind of giant global brain at the same time as a community for all of us. So, you know, I mean, a lot of that tip or that balance between those two different possibilities, one in which we all merge into the, you know, the Borg, and the other, you know, the other being, you know, where we all remain, you know, individuals too. I think that a lot of the variables in that depend on the ways in which the artificial neural nets get introduced into the system.
You just mentioned something interesting, that our intelligence is a result of evolution and that it's a result of our social interactions. So if we try to model artificial intelligence in a similar way, so let's say take a couple of neural networks and let them compete, would that be at all dangerous?
Well, first of all, the difference between compete and collaborate is, I think, almost semantic. You know, this is something that goes a little bit by the wayside in this discussion. And we do have systems that involve competing neural nets, if you want to think about it that way, already. There are GANs, generative adversarial networks. There is an artist and a critic, and they play against each other. They play a game in which the artist is trying to fool the critic, and the critic is trying to suss out, you know, when a media product comes from the artist versus coming from the original distribution. So it's adversarial, right? They're playing against each other. At the same time, when you zoom out and you look at the two of them as a system, it's a system that spirals upward and that improves. The artist and the critic improve together in much the same way that if you and I were to play chess many times, we would both improve our game of chess. And so, you know, is it adversarial? Is it cooperative? It actually sort of depends on what scale you look at it from. So, you know, I think in many ways, when we think about whether something is adversarial or cooperative, we're really thinking more about the emotional valence, you know, about sort of who we're empathizing with, or what system we're empathizing with, and what polarities, you know, the winning and the losing have in, you know, from that perspective. So an ecology, you know, is something that becomes complex and wonderful and interesting, but it relies on predation, you know, and other sorts of interactions in which there are winners and losers, in which, you know, certain animals get eaten, you know, and so on. We ourselves are the result of a long process like that. I mean, if you look at it, you know, in very dark terms, I mean, all of our civilization, our intelligence, and so on, you know, is like a flower growing out of a pile of carnage. But, you know, I choose not to look at it that way as well. I think that there is something beautiful about that entire process. I think that looking at nature as a pile of carnage and civilization as some kind of flower on top negates the fact that cooperation and competition have happened at every level of that entire thing. And you know, if complexity means something, it's the expanding circles of empathy and the greater scales at which thinking can happen, if that makes sense, in that emerging system.
So trying to value it this way as saying it might be dangerous because I, as a human, would look at it and say it's emotionally bad, it's just a human bias? Or is there maybe, if you look at nature on its own, would you say that in nature, when, let's say, a weak animal gets eaten, is there an inherent value in that we are able to recognize because we have a certain level of intelligence? Or is it just completely dead if that kind of intelligence that we have wouldn't be in the universe?
Well, I mean, the reason that animals have the beautiful shapes that they do is because they've been eating each other, you know, for hundreds of millions of years. So it's not possible to decouple the beauty of a cat, you know, whether it's a tiger or a domestic cat, from what it does, you know, and what it has done over time. You know, which is, you know, or to decouple the idea of play from the idea of hunting in that case. Now, I also think that you know, we as humans, we have we've built up ideas about fairness, about justice, about equity, about empathy with, in some, increasingly universal sense, increasingly universal suffrage in voting, increasing sense of universality of human rights, and so on. And I think this is a really wonderful thing. But I also think I see it as continuous with a long history. I don't see it as some kind of anomaly that happens now. It's the same as the way our cells in our body care about each other, if you want to think about it that way. Right, that harm to one is harm to all, and that doesn't mean that, I mean, our cells are not all created equal. I'm not saying that cells have anything like human rights, but there is an emerging togetherness. I know this is very heady, but I do see it as fundamental to what intelligence is. I think we often don't understand intelligence at its many scales in this sense, and I do think it's important.
Okay, no, I think I get your point. So I was listening to your interview recently, and would you say you mentioned Walter Benjamin there? Would you say you're an enthusiast of Walter Benjamin?
Yes, hugely so.
So how would you say Walter Benjamin thought is connected to AI? Or if you would rather just talk about critical theory as a whole, that would also be amazing.
Well, I can speak to a couple of different. Walter Benjamin is a giant subject. He did a lot, but I can maybe speak to two specific writings that have been very influential for me, and explain a little bit about why. One of them, which I wrote a long essay about, is called A Little History of Photography. I think that's what it's called, and it's about media, and about the way media was transformed by mass reproduction, and he talked about things like value and aura, and the way when mass media start to emerge, it sort of democratizes art in certain fundamental ways. And I think that there are parallels to the kind of democratization and the kind of changes in valuation that happened when mass reproduction became possible, and what is happening now, which is essentially that AI kinds of techniques are poised to democratize production as well as reproduction. Now, I also think that the boundary between production and reproduction is much thinner than we believe. There's an artist who I really love, David Lebrun. He lives in LA, and he makes these videos of human artifacts that sort of morph from one instance to another. So like he has one on his website of bronze finials from Iran, and it's just sort of a morph of finials that make it very clear that all of these finials, all of these kind of decorative iron elements that that went on the tops of pieces of architecture, are actually almost like slices through a hyperobject, in time. And so we think about that maybe as more craft than art, but again, I think this is an artificial distinction. That these beautiful things that emerge from civilization as a whole, and is it production? Is it reproduction? I mean, I think it's somewhere in between. And the vast majority of art that humans have made does not distinguish between those things. That's a very modern Western conception, Renaissance onward in the West. Another writing that I think is really important of Benjamin's and that has influenced me tremendously is one of his very last. It might be his last, actually. The Theses on the Philosophy of History, or on the Concept of History, as it's sometimes called, and it's a very lyrical set of paragraphs. It's short, and it's mystical in a way, but it's about the idea of historicism. And what I talked about earlier with respect to life building on top of life, and in a way, I mean, he had a very dark take on all of this. He was on the run from the Nazis at the time, and he wrote this very shortly before he committed suicide in 1940. But he wrote about the way history is in a way a parade of horrors. That what we see is as a story is actually the spoils of civilizations that came before, carried along in a procession, and that we empathize, that historicism empathizes with the victor inevitably, and that therefore we kind of should view it as our as a requirement to sort of think about those spoils with skepticism, to understand the work and the labor of all of the unseen people who were fundamental in shaping societies, and who are hidden by the way history gets narrativized.
The last point you made about the spells in history, how would you connect that to, let's say, 2021 and artificial intelligence?
Well, I think that one way of looking at the training data for natural language models is as spoils, right? So if we think about the giant corpus of of everything that we can find online that can be used to train a language model, those are the cultural treasures, if you like. I mean, it's whether it looks like just flotsam and jetsam, or it looks like cultural treasures, I guess, is a matter of perspective. But it's the visible part, and these language models are trained, on those things, and then they reproduce. In very much the Walter Benjamin sense, certain aspects of that culture, but what they carry forward, is a very partial view. Not all languages are represented equally in that corpus. Not all life ways are represented equally in that corpus. Not all kinds of people are represented equally in that corpus. And so, we should be, this gets into ML fairness sorts of issues, right? We should be viewing with a level of critique and skepticism, who is represented there, what that will reproduce, when we carry it forward. And it raises some very powerful challenges, I think, to to the way we train ML models as well. It's twofold. One is a technical problem, which is, how do we evolve to be able to train models in ways that can use much smaller amounts of data, and don't rely on just sheer volume, which is much harder to balance, right? Because these spoils are overwhelmingly, say, in English and Western, and et cetera, et cetera. And the other one that is maybe subtler but even more interesting is, what does it mean for for us to even think about what is good or bad in these models? I mean, in ML fairness or AI ethics, we often talk about models working equally well for different people, but I think that's quite a superficial view. Equally well only makes sense for the simplest of applications, like can it equally well recognize faces of different sorts of people? But the moment you start to make machine learning models that do more complicated things like model language, then you also have to start interrogating the loss functions and even the idea that a loss function is being optimized. That also is sort of a spoils of the victor kind of illusion.
You mentioned art when you were talking about Walter Benjamin, and I was wondering, because you gave a really interesting talk related to machines and creativity, and I was wondering, do you think that a machine can be truly creative, or will be at one point?
Well, what does the question mean to you?
For me personally, I would say that what is art is just a reflection of our human experience, right? That's the basic answer. It gives me kind of similar empty feeling, but also purely aesthetically, it's just really good. But it's a question too, what do you think creativity even is?
Yeah, I don't think there's any simple answer. And I think that depending on how you define it, the answers would be different. So if we just think about aesthetics for a second, then, I mean, attempting to aestheticize is also attempting to remove the sort of a lot of the cultural communication aspects of all of this, that the sense of what is being conveyed, what's the author, what's the reading, and so on, and really just think about it in a more sensual or sensuous way. What's the feeling evoked? Suzanne Langer, the art critic and theorist from many years ago, talked about feeling and form, and what's the feeling conveyed. If we just think about things in terms of like making stuff that is pretty, making stuff that is realistic, then that's where the little history of photography stuff is interesting, right? I mean, a painting that is highly realistic, like Vermeer, for example, right? That sort of renders, optical effects, using paint in a highly convincing way. That was obviously very valued in Northern Europe at the time. But the moment cameras and photography come along, that's no longer, like, the playing field moves, because that's now cheap, right? That's now easy to do. So that meant that painting had to go in different directions, in order to test its mettle, right? In order for it to be more than an empty exercise in skill. And I think that we're in a similar period now, where, for example, a very, very complex video game level, can be invented by an AI that has, forests and castles and, monsters of all kinds and so on, that are all kind of interpolations in some way of things that are already floating around, in the training data set. And that if you thought about them as an artwork created by, a single artist or a team of artists, a few years ago, it would blow your mind. but now is almost like just opening a tap. This is, I mean, it's not something super new. This is something that I think the composer David Cope really explored quite beautifully with respect to musical composition way back in the 80s and beyond. So he used more classical kinds of AI, not neural nets, but things more like classical language models to write scores. And they were trained, but they're not deep nets, but they're trained statistically, and you could train them to, for example, write harpsichord music in the style of Bach, or to write things in the style of Mozart. And he generated a huge amount of controversy at the time, because first it was not that good or not that convincing, quote unquote, or realistic, and then it was, and then nobody wanted to believe him. It was horrifying that he was doing this, and nobody wanted to believe that it was really a computer doing it. So he, for example, put in order to just disprove all of the critics, he put a zip file on his website of 5,000 cantatas in the style of Bach, and there was something like really screw you about that, of course, like nobody can compose 5,000 cantatas in the style of Bach in a lifetime, and many of them are quite beautiful. But at the same time, when you can do that, it suddenly devalues in a certain way the writing of a cantata in the style of Bach. Like it's no longer, I mean, it may still be beautiful, but it's still beautiful in the same way that if you pick up a single leaf, in fall, right, and you look at it closely, it's a thing of beauty, right? And then you look around and you're like, damn, there are 10 trillion other leaves on the ground here. So now you have to shift your frame of reference entirely in thinking about what is the value, or what does it mean, right? What is art? So we're in a period of shifting values about all of this. And if you think about it from a purely classical artistic point of view, then you can imagine that AI just introduces a bunch of new tools, just like a camera, and that therefore we have to shift, how we value individual artworks. But I think there are more profound ways of looking at it too, from a more systems perspective, and just noticing that, artificial neural nets introduce new levels of complexity into the supermind, if you want to think about it that way, and that sorts of beauty, varieties of beauty, and complexities and scales of beauty are possible now that were kind of unattainable with the old suite of things, and it's and this is just sort of another stage in this flowering of the planet, if you want to think about it that way.
That's fascinating. I would love to continue, but we have to move on to the next subject, which is about a value alignment problem. And I have a question for you. Would you say that we have a choice to wire an AI however we like? Because there is a possibility that a super intelligent machine would be able to break out of our realm of understanding completely and be unintelligible and completely unpredictable as well. I think this happened at Google, right? You created, not you personally, but you created some sort of an artificial intelligence model, and it just started to communicate between itself or something else with an own language.
I've seen a few different. Something like that came out of Facebook.
Facebook, okay.
AI, right, a while ago. I think that particular result was a bit overhyped or marketed a little bit. Let's say.
Okay.
Not that FAIR is has not done a lot of really interesting work. I'm not disparaging Facebook's AI group. I think they're really strong. But more broadly, I don't believe, first of all, in the idea of being able to make laws of robotics, Asimov style, and being able to make an intelligent system that just sort of follows some laws. I think, I mean, even Asimov, when he wrote those laws of robotics, right, was implicitly critiquing them in a variety of ways. He was using story as his method of critique. We don't operate that way. I think that intelligence that somehow follows, we sort of have fooled ourselves, because we connect computing, like classical computing that follows a program, with AI, and believe that AI is just is going to be hyper rational, because of that, right? But that's a completely wrong idea. Like when you have a neural net, which is capable of doing things that appear a lot more intelligent than a set of rules, it doesn't spell things perfectly all the time. It doesn't get the answers correct to simple addition problems. That actually has to be learned again from scratch, sort of the way we do. So it's really different from programming. and it's different in all the same ways that our brains are different from from just a set of procedures. If the question is, how do we keep intelligent systems, under our control, I would say that that cat has been let out of the bag a long time ago. And I'm not talking about, about artificial neural nets. I'm just talking about the financial system or political systems or companies. These are intelligences too that are emergent. And that come out of the interoperation of a lot of people, working together in much the same way that neurons work together in a brain, and they are not really explainable. They're not really transparent. They sometimes, follow logics or rules that are not good or helpful. We can see the push and pull of I don't know, the auto industry and then regulations on it. For example, over the years and essentially it's politics that I'm describing. I think it's kind of politics all the way up and down. Like you make a system, it interacts with other systems, and it's in the push and pull of all of those systems with each other that sort of meanings and values emerge. So, I certainly am as concerned as anybody else with making AI systems that are legible. But that means something pretty different from the kind of explainability that you might request of linear code, right? Where it's if this then that kind of stuff. When we make up stories about why we do things, we are certainly not telling those stories in terms of one neuron firing and then another neuron firing, right? We're talking about motivations. We're talking about what we learned certain things from. We're storytelling, and we're doing very few shot learning. Right, when we do that sort of thing, those are emerging areas in natural language neural net models, and I think they're going to be very fruitful in terms of allowing those kinds of neural nets to interoperate with us in the same way that we interoperate with each other. Right, using language, using justifications, talking about whys and wherefores, talking about rules as opposed to illustrating them with a million examples and so on.
That would indicate that there is just one type of intelligence universally. And I have a question. Maybe I'm wrong. You wouldn't say so.
No, I think there are many. I mean, well, first of all, the idea of intelligence as being a scalar, for example, is obviously wrong. I mean, from looking at many different sorts of people, right, we know that people can have a lot of different kinds of capacities, and the idea of an IQ that somehow measures intelligence is nonsense.
Oh yeah, I just meant that. What I meant is regarding to what you said about how, let's say, politics is an intelligent system comparable to AI.
Yeah, I mean, maybe intelligence is not that different from just complexity in that sense. So, I'm not sure how I would differentiate intelligence from complexity. I guess the thing that we have that animals for the most part, other animals for the most part don't have, is language, and is the ability to tell stories, and to do the kind of cultural accumulation, right? I mean, cultural accumulation is the big delta between us and the other animal species on Earth, and language is very fundamental to that.
That's all connected. I have a question that's connected to that I really wanted to ask. Do you remember NASA's Voyager spacecraft that was launched into space with the golden records?
Of course, yeah.
So they contained
Andrian's voice on it and so on. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and the images that were there were done in a way that was supposed to be recognizable by intelligent creatures of the universe. It often seems like the intelligence we possess is something universal. It seems that it's universal, but I can also myself imagine other forms of being in the universe being completely unimaginable to us, like a conscious cloud, for example, or a society that progressed to be fully converted into some sort of a different plane of existence or consciousness, which might as well happen to us with AI, if you're optimistic in the future. So I'm wondering, do you feel like, I know like technically there wasn't a point of sending that because we know that in our proximity there's nobody, but
right, it's not going to reach anything in our lifetime.
Suppose it's like sent to space universally to the entire, whatever it means, the entire cosmos. Would you say that there is a point of that, or other civilizations would be something completely different?
I kind of suspect yes. I mean, when I was a kid, I had some of these kind of thoughts about, I mean, if you're watching, I don't know, Star Trek or things like, I wasn't a big Trekkie, but a lot of this sort of pulp, sci-fi, imagines that aliens are humanoid, I guess for budget reasons or something, right? And that's obviously silly, and of course there's no reason for a life form that evolved independently, or maybe from a common some kind of primitive bacterial thing, if you believe in panspermia, right, to have anything like our shape or our kind of language or whatever. So of course it'll be much more varied than one sees in pulp sci-fi. But I actually have come to believe that that many things about what we see on Earth are if not universal, are pretty strong functions of some of the really basic things about matter, that do obtain, everywhere as far as we know in our universe, in the sense that, how many times have eyes, evolved independently on Earth? It's many, right? Like the octopus's eye, and our eye, like their common ancestor is like a single photosensitive cell. In a clam or something, and there are differences in the eyes, of course. Like the irises are shaped differently, the retinas are back to front versus front to back, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, it's an optical instrument, and light is really important in everywhere in the universe, basically. I mean, you can imagine places, I don't know if life had evolved on the inside of a hollow asteroid, right? Maybe light wouldn't matter there. Or maybe it would. Maybe if anything learned how to bioluminesce, then that would be a signal, and then it would be important.
What about the reasoning itself? Because throughout history, we see that humans took our way of reasoning and put it into a computer. And now a computer kind of reasons. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm not an expert. I'm a philosophy student. But a computer kind of reasons like us, right? And then we apply that reasoning to development of artificial intelligence. Is there any other ways to go to conceptualize this, or is it just the ultimate way?
I don't think that we do quite as much of putting our way of reasoning into artificial neural nets as maybe we believe. I mean, I think that, of course, if you train a language model, on a corpus of internet text, then you are putting a lot, every imaginable human bias right into that, because language is saturated with all of those biases. But on the other hand, if you train, say, a visual neural net, a convolutional neural net on random video in the world. I mean, what is random is not an obvious question either. There's no universal prior of what a camera is, right? But let's just imagine that you have some pretty random video that is taken all over the world, maybe in a virgin environment that doesn't even have human technologies in it, right? What it will learn is under the right conditions is an embedding space that learns about invariances and learns about things like objects and develops metrics for similarity of things that are not unlike the ones that we have. And what that means in practice is that a network trained that way, I suspect, could learn with very few shot learning to do things like discriminate between forks, knives, and spoons, even if it had never seen them before. So in that sense, I think that there is something quite universal afoot about say the visual sense and what that implies about the metrics between things. So yeah, I think that there's more about this that is universal maybe than certainly than I thought as a child. Doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch of just so stories in there, but parallel evolution of wildly different branches of life on Earth is, I believe, is a clue.
In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you're not convinced that AI singularity will happen. Do you still believe that?
Well, I'm not fond of a lot of the ideas of the singularity people. I think that they're based on some false metaphors. But yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by the singularity.
I would say it's like an exponential explosion in development of artificial intelligence that would, in the end, create a super intelligent machine that would completely obliterate humans in any task. And also it would be able to create its own goals and motivations.
Okay, so yeah, there are things about that singularity argument that I think are obvious and that are not specific to AI or to Moore's law or to anything modern, and there are aspects of it that I think are based on a kind of false metaphor that is all about our ape ancestry, if you like, and our ideas about dominance hierarchies. And that's the part that I really think is problematic. So as far as exponential growth or complexification or whatever, yes, I mean, of course, things are speeding up history is speeding up in an exponential way. And that's almost trivial, to see. I mean, all you have to do is, look at the human population curve, and you see, something super exponential. Although, interestingly and importantly, we're now, thank goodness, right, approaching a plateau and hopefully a decline after that. Otherwise, because we're already well above the Earth's carrying capacity, at least with anything like the way of life that we have had. That's not specific to humans either. I mean, the sense that history is speeding up is something that you can see in any kind of big history picture of the universe, where nothing happens and then everything happens. Right? So this speed up is a natural function of the fact that innovations, whether they're human inventions, whether they're AI or the steam engine or multicellularity or building tails or whatever it is that you want, they always rely on other inventions that are prerequisites. So there's a cascade at work there. I don't think it's a mystery why things speed up, right? There are more and more things that can recombine. So more and more platform technologies, if you like, to make new technologies, some of which will in turn also be platform technologies. So hence there's an exponential at play there. Now, so yeah, that part I think is obvious, and AI is not particularly different from everything that has come before. And I would put, I talked about intelligence residing in things like companies and governments and the stock market and so on, earlier. And those are, just as much a part of the story as artificial neural nets, in my opinion.
But there is a view that let's say, like the Moore's law you mentioned, that the exponential growth in the computing power does not necessarily mean more intelligent systems.
The traditional view of Moore's law itself, at least as originally formulated, I guess Kumi's law, is no longer, is actually no longer happening, right? Where that saturated sometime around 2005, 2006, but we're still increasing our capabilities exponentially in many, many ways. Again, because of this platforms building on top of platforms. Will that result in us being able to build things like brains, like our own brains? I've always believed yes. I started off, life as a computational neuroscientist, which means, that you approach neuroscience, from a computational standpoint. You think about neurons and what they're computing, and and we don't believe in souls, and so in that sense, like of course, if we can do more and more computation in other ways, what prevents us from being able to build things that do what the brain does? Life at the same time is not just about brains. And it's not just about thinking or being intelligent in the senses that we mean. And this is where I think the singularity argument goes a little bit awry. The idea that making a very, very intelligent system will result by whatever definition of it, able to do many different sorts of tasks, for example, right? The idea that will result in something that comes around and obsoletes us, in the same way that we've made life impossible for the gorillas, or something, is mixing metaphors in a way. We are life forms that have competed in a Darwinian way, or outcompeted or removed the territories, removed the ecologies, right, of other life forms on Earth. Could we imagine that things that we make or that we produce, eliminate the ecologies that we rely on for our survival? Well, we don't need to imagine that. I mean, we've been, building internal combustion engines and things that have been, accelerating climate change for the last, many, many years. And if we don't act quickly to evolve those technologies and to restore, some of these kind of ecological balances. I mean, right, we don't really know where we are in that scale of, from before a tipping point, after a tipping point, still able to make changes, right? We're really in trouble. Like, those are the existential risks that I feel like we need to be concerned about. The idea that we're going to make an AI and the AI is going to come and eat us for breakfast feels to me like it's almost like a boogeyman sort of thing. It's like we're there's a sock puppet and we're imagining that the sock puppet is a more dominant gorilla in our tribe. We haven't built dominance hierarchies and and a sense of like alpha male competition into these kind of things. And I think it's very telling that all of the proponents of these arguments are men. Who are generally in positions of great privilege. They're the Elon Musks and of the world, and in a sense, like, only the paranoid survive, right? That, if you're a silverback gorilla, and any change in the status quo or in the environment is a great fall for you, then it makes sense to see every change in conditions as a threat. But I certainly don't think that that's the only way of looking at things. And I think that, if you look to Donna Haraway and to the other, largely female, philosophers who have looked at cyber feminism, xenofeminism, et cetera, they have a very different perspective on all of this that I think is at least equally valid, and that has very different kinds of conclusions.
One last short question regarding the stuff you mentioned. That's the question I ask all my guests, but it perfectly coincides with what you just said. Is AI gonna kill us all?
I think that if we all die, it will be because we have made the planet uninhabitable for us. I think the idea that we make AI, and AI, somehow turns into a Darwinian life form and comes back and kills us the way we have killed so many other species is, again, so it's sort of a mixing of scales. I mean, obviously, we can always screw up. We can always, do awful things to ourselves, in various ways, including using artificial neural nets. There are many ways that we can, train nets to, and deploy nets in socio-technical systems that can cause great harm, and perhaps even existential harm. But I don't think that that's a result of creating things that are intelligent or that can do all the things that we do, but rather a result of us just, misusing technologies or doing, how can I put this? Us trying to take all of those capabilities and deploying them in the service of our sort of dominance hierarchy way of thinking, as opposed to that somehow being implicit in intelligence. That doesn't make any sense. There are plenty of things that compete with each other, kill each other, so on, and have have little or no intelligence. Right? That Darwinian thing has nothing to do with reasoning or thinking. Right? That's an instrument or a tool or a capacity, just like having an opposable thumb.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do the podcast. I know you're very busy.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Bartolome. And I look forward to continuing the conversation sometime. They were really great questions.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider to like, subscribe, and share. I also recommend following the AI Tomorrow podcast on Twitter and Instagram to make sure you don't miss out on any clips from future episodes.